Thank you for tuning in to this video of the STR Division's new Career Paths initiative. The goal of this initiative is to more closely connect the worlds of business research and practice. And today I'm talking with Elise Tak, and Elise is currently a senior UX researcher at Google. And you're coming up on your 1-year anniversary there, I think. You started in July of last year, is that right?
Yeah, just about. Yeah, it's been a good year.
I'm glad to hear that. And thank you so much for spending some time with us. You were also a survey scientist and UX researcher at Airbnb. And then before that, you did PhD work at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. So rather than me talk more about you, could you maybe introduce yourself a bit more in your own words? And feel free to share anything that you would like to about your background. And if you would like a prompt, I'd love to know more about your main responsibilities in your current position, but also just anything about your background.
Yeah, sounds good. Hey, everyone, I am Elise. I graduated from my PhD program in 2018 and have since worked in industry. Now it's been about 2.5 years. I've absolutely enjoyed this new career path that I've chosen in UX research. I'm really happy to share about the world of UX research with you all because I think oftentimes a lot of PhD students end up taking jobs in data science, and I've seen a lot of friends who excel and succeed in those career paths. UX research is a little bit lesser known, and I think a lot of you actually may be a really good fit for it. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about this world of UX research.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about your current work and the roles that research have played in your life and the ways you think that we can more closely connect business research and practice.
Yeah, so I'll first start talking about kind of what UX research is. So UX stands for user experience research. And a lot of times when people hear the word UX, people think it's the UX design, like the kind of the visual interface that you see when you land on a website or on your app. But in parallel to the design process, there's actually a very rigorous research process that goes with it. So UX research is very unique in that it's really, really focused on the user experience. So what are the motivations of users? What are the needs of those users? And how are they behaving, on the app? So let's say that, with data science or which is a common career path for a lot of PhDs, we will have tremendous and very thorough logs data of, kind of the various engagements, right? Various engagement metrics. So click-throughs or how far people swipe, stuff like that. How long people spend on that. And we have an exhaustive universe of data for that. But let me give you an example. Let's say Netflix, which is a company that I don't work for, let's say Netflix comes up with a carousel, like a recommendation carousel that shows popular in your city. So in my case, that would be San Francisco. And we do an A/B test with data scientists and learn that, okay, with this carousel, we get a 1% lift in like successful views, whatever that means, however they measure it. So, 1% lift is great, but is it really great? Like, what's the counterfactual? Like, could it have been higher? Are actually users kind of iffy about this feature? We don't really know that unless we actually talk to our users or survey our users about what the perception of that carousel is or these recommendations are. So this is when UX research comes in, whether it's quantitative methods or qualitative methods, to really think about, is something that we're building, is it a pleasant user experience? Is it making it easier, faster, and better for the users? So in that sense, UX research is kind of uniquely positioned to advocate for our users and think about users as opposed to just kind of business metrics or performance metrics.
You mentioned a lot of research skills in there, A/B testing, pretty core research design idea. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of skills that you acquired in your graduate work that you still use? And maybe some skills that you wish you had learned as a graduate student for the work that you do?
Yeah, so I think I used to run quite a bit of experiments, and part of that is about building out a survey. I think for most cases, UX researchers don't actually run the experiments. That often falls under kind of the engineering or data science realms, although that varies by companies. So it's not our bread and butter, but I do run a lot of surveys, whether it's in-app surveys or kind of more kind of Qualtrics panel surveys to get a kind of user sentiment or perception of our products. One thing that at least my program wasn't super like kind of rigorous on is kind of qualitative research methods. My program was very quantitative, but actually a lot of UX researchers have like qualitative backgrounds, and they do end up running a lot of qualitative research, such as interviews or focus groups, because of the kinds of questions that we want to answer, right? It's about users' perceptions and needs. And that's really hard to elicit simply with surveys or kind of logs data. So that may be unique to kind of my background, but I think my sense is that a lot of strategy scholars aren't like experts on qualitative methods, and that would be something that you will, really ramp up and learn a lot and learn to appreciate as a UX researcher. When I was working at Airbnb, when we think about like how people plan their trips, right? The data that we have has a selection bias in the sense that we only know what's happening on the platform. So what we often do is do home visits where we agree with our potential users and say, like, we're gonna come in and watch how you plan a trip. So we look at the postcards on their, post-its on their laptops. We see them text messaging with their friends. We see them having 17 different tabs open. And that's kind of how we learn how to build from these qualitative methods.
Can you talk a little bit about what led you to the PhD program?
Yeah, I really wanted to try consulting because that was very like a glamorous job when I was coming out of my graduate program. And I thought it was kind of like a very like ambidextrous kind of job, like in the sense that both kind of your EQ and IQ matters. So I thought it was a good fit for me. Unfortunately, when I tried out the job and kind of looked at, like 10 years ahead and kind of looking to the partners at the firm, and asked myself, do I want to be that person 10, 15 years from now? For a variety of reasons, the answer was a no. And when I was an undergrad at Michigan as a BBA, I had a privilege of working for Professor Michael Jensen, who's still there. I was his RA, and I really enjoyed the research process. So I wanted to go deeper into it, and I had every intention of, staying in academia. But when it was my turn to graduate, I also looked to other options in the area and ended up switching actually to industry.
You wrote a very insightful and reflective essay about some of that decision on Medium.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
one thing I really connected with there was you had friends who told you not to worry. You have a PhD. Of course, you'll be fine with whatever you do. So when people aren't in academia, I don't think they really understand some of the process of completing a PhD and then figuring out what's next. So could you talk a little bit about how you navigated the? I mean, you just mentioned how you looked 10 years into the future in the consulting world and you decided, is this where I imagine myself? Is that something you also did as a PhD student, or was the process a little different? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think after a PhD, it was a mixed bag of factors. One was an extremely tight labor market at the time, so I couldn't find a job that I really wanted to take that would be in a city that I wanted to live in. So a part of that was a constraint kind of caused by by the the extremely competitive job market. So that's on the one side. On the other side, I was really drawn to the idea of UX research because I felt like it would be really fun, and that's what I learned. Like 2.5 years into the job, I still feel like it's really fun talking to our users and building a product. And yeah, for that reason, I I really enjoyed this career path. And when I want to get a kind of different flavors of the kind of two jobs that I had. At Airbnb, I was one of the early researchers on this very nascent product called Airbnb Experiences. So not a lot of people still know this because of the pandemic, but it's kind of activities that you can book on Airbnb with local hosts. So you can say go to like say Madrid or Barcelona and make like paella with locals. So that's the product that I was working on. And it was very, very nascent. When you look at the weekly number of bookings, it was just really, really small. And when you work on a product like that, research a product like that, it's very, very unique because, think about kind of the biases, like the sampling biases that you have, like these extreme early adopters who are extreme Airbnb lovers. Doing research like that with those kinds of populations and trying to extrapolate that to a product that can scale to much larger population base, it's very, very it's a very unique set of challenges. On the other hand, when you think about Google, it's literally used by 2 billion people every day. Like that is a very different kinds of priorities and populations that you're dealing with. So even within UX research, there's just such diversity of challenges and kind of learning that happens even 2.5 years out from graduation, that I still feel like I'm always learning and learning from my colleagues and even from my users all the time.
Do you and your colleagues draw on academic research in your job? And if so, what sources do you look to solve some of the problems that you face with these UX design issues?
Yeah, I would say our kind of connection with academia is fairly limited. There are a lot of PhDs, sorry, there are a lot of UX researchers who hold PhDs, but only a small subset of them still kind of stay connected to academia. And vast majority of them are more closely aligned to HCI, the human computer interaction discipline. That is kind of the sort of core kind of bread and butter pipeline from which UX researchers come from. Having said that, I don't think that needs to be the case. I think that is an opportunity because I think there are so many kind of like expertise. There are so many expertise that, for instance, like UX researchers can draw on. As a concrete example, all companies in the world care about trust, right? And at Airbnb, it was very salient because when something goes wrong on Airbnb, it's disastrous, right? People don't have a place to stay. Google gets sued all the time for trust issues or privacy issues. So we're always thinking about how do we measure trust? Like what are the long-term implications of a bad press? We're in many ways we're tackling the same problem, but there just hasn't been a very fluid conversation between kind of folks in industry who work on this and the academics.
And this is part of the motivation for this Career Paths initiative, is the idea that, well, if we start to support a broad diversity of career paths, that can actually bring research and practice closer together through people doing PhDs, going into companies, remaining at least engaged in some way with the academic side. The strategy division of AOM has about 5,300 members, and only 4% of them identify as practitioners. It's almost exclusively academics. So why do you think some of that separation exists? What is the reason that there isn't more of a, I mean, HCI is, I would imagine, very closely tied, and probably some of the people who have PhDs in UX come out of HCI programs.
Absolutely, yeah.
These other areas seem somewhat relevant. So why do you think there is some of that barrier?
I think from companies' perspective, I understand kind of the reluctance of like sharing data, especially if if the goal of kind of that sharing is to result in like an external publication. You can kind of understand kind of the PR risks there. So I can see the company side, but but also I think from academic point of view, I think one of the challenges is kind of the medium and the pace with which academic research is conducted. for instance, like any company that you you'd like to work with, their timeline for project ranges from like 3 weeks to half a year. A half a year project is an extremely large project that probably warrants like an Apple iOS event or launch, big launch moment. And contrast that with kind of the pace of academic research, and you can see kind of some of the differences there. I think though, a point that I really want to drive home is about communication. So I have one published article and I cannot even access my own article because of the paywall. Yeah. And let's say I've successfully kind of gotten to my article. I think we're in a world of 15-second videos and everything being like a snackable insight, right? You need to get to the TLDR in like a minute. And I think the medium of academic publishing is a little bit difficult to parse, and not only because of its length, but also kind of its language for reasonable, smart people who work in companies, right? You should ask ourselves, like, is my smart uncle who work at corporation X, is he or she able to read this and parse this? And I think in a lot of cases, it might not be true. And I think that could be like the way we communicate our research could be adapted to kind of meet the growing demand for snackable and quick insights.
Are you and your colleagues reading papers from human-computer interaction research that are posted on repositories, or how are you getting that information from that field that you do seem to be engaged with quite deeply?
So I've attended one like HCI academic conference, and since then I think most of my work, my kind of learning actually comes from internal like research database. So within Google there is a very large database, and same for Airbnb. So it's been kind of within company, but also there are kind of industry conferences for UX researchers, as well as Medium blogs where people share their new research endeavors. So that's kind of my primary source of getting information, as opposed to academic research publications or conferences.
And if a current graduate student in a business program really wanted to follow your footsteps, would you suggest they go to some of those conferences or contact the companies and ask if they could distribute their research? What would you advise someone in maybe the second, third, or fourth year of a PhD program to start doing?
To become a UX researcher? Or?
Yeah, if they saw themselves following your path rather than another path.
Yeah. I would say focus on the PhD and see, because I think until fourth or fifth year, you don't really know, what research is. So I think, once you've committed to it, try your best, see if it works out for you. I see if it's for you, not works out for you. But I would say one thing that I think would be useful for anyone, whether they're aspiring professors or UX researchers, is communicating your research in a manner that is interesting to lay people. So by interesting, it means that something they can understand and something that they care about. So for instance, if I were to talk about my prior research, I would go deep into the homophily theory and how so-and-so published this paper. But for a vast majority of the world, that is not super, super interesting. Rather, what they might find interesting is that I went out to career fairs at Stanford and Berkeley universities and talked to a lot of recruiters and students who are looking for jobs and saw how they were networking. They might find that aspect of the research more interesting. So I think what I would advise them to do is thinking about research and thinking about the audience and how we can make our research more interesting and something exciting for the lay audience. And that's important because that not only helps you potentially get a job, but potentially if you're a professor, you might be able to collaborate with that company if you're able to appeal to the value of your research to folks outside of academia. So I think communicating with your audience in mind would be a really, really useful skill set to have. No, thank you so much, Nick, for moderating. I think the last thing I would say to aspiring, PhD students is that y'all are working really, really hard and you're all really smart. So no matter where you end up, whether it's in academia or industry, you will really enjoy what you do. So, try your best. And if you're interested, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can find me at Elise Tak, Google.